There is a sound that winter makes in the far north of Sweden, a sound that exists nowhere else on earth. It is not the howl of the wind, nor the crack of ice splitting beneath the weight of its own frozen bones. It is something older, something that lives in the spaces between snowflakes, in the pause between heartbeats. The Sami people called it the breath of the sleeping gods. The Finns called it a warning. In the winter of 1674, in a parish called Torsåker, that sound changed. It became a scream. The historical archives of Sweden preserve a phrase that even now carries the weight of unmarked graves. Det stora avseendet, the great noise. Scholars have debated its meaning for centuries. Some say it referred to the chaos of mass hysteria. Others claim it described the literal cacophony of accusations, confessions, and wailing that consumed the northern provinces. But if you had stood in the frozen silence of Torsåker that winter, you would have understood what it truly meant. It was the sound of 71 coffins being measured before their occupants had even been accused. The snow fell that year with a particular heaviness, as though the sky itself was trying to bury what was coming. The village of Torsåker sat huddled against the forest, like a wounded animal, its wooden cabins exhaling thin ribbons of smoke into the gray nothing above. The people there lived as their ancestors had lived, by the axe, by the plow, by prayers muttered into calloused hands. They feared the wolves that circled in the darkness beyond the tree line. They feared the long nights that could swallow a man's sanity whole. But they did not yet know they should fear each other. On the edge of this settlement, where the cultivated fields surrendered to the ancient pines, stood a cabin that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Its timbers were older than the village church. Moss grew in patterns on its walls that the local women whispered looked like runes, and inside, a woman named Margareta stood at her window, watching the crows gather on the church steeple, and understood that death had finally found its way north. The court records of the Hamar district, the Dombacher, refer to her simply as Fors Finskan, Margareta, the Finnish woman from Fors. In the language of 17th century Swedish bureaucracy, this was not merely a geographical designation. It was a brand. The Finns were people of the old ways, the deep forests, the shamanic traditions that Christianity had spent centuries trying to burn out of existence. To be Finnish was to be suspect. To be a Finnish woman living alone at the edge of the woods was to already have one foot on the executioner's block. But Margareta had lived with suspicion her entire life. What troubled her now was something far worse than the sideways glances of her neighbors. She could see what was coming, not in the way of fortune-tellers or charlatans. Margareta had no patience for such theater. Her sight was older than that, inherited from grandmothers who had whispered secrets into her infant ears before the priest could baptize them away. She saw the world as it truly was, a fabric of energies, currents, and presences that most people had long forgotten how to perceive. And for weeks now, she had watched something terrible gathering above Torsåker, like a bruise forming on the skin of the sky. The entity had no name in any human language. Margareta called it the hunger, because that was what it was. A vast, patient emptiness that fed on fear the way fire feeds on oxygen. It had followed the witch panic northward from Dalarna, growing fat on the terror of 6 years of accusations and executions. Now it hovered over her village, and she could smell its presence, in the metallic taste of the air, could feel its anticipation in the way the forest had gone unnaturally silent. The crows on the steeple were not crows at all. They were its eyes. The first true crack in Torsåker's fragile peace came on an October morning when the church doors opened to reveal strangers. They were boys, adolescents from the parish of Nordingrå, their faces pale and sharp, with a fervor that made Margareta's skin crawl. The villagers called them the Visgossarna, the wise boys. They claimed they possessed a divine gift, the ability to see the invisible mark of Satan branded on the foreheads of those who had made dark covenants. They positioned themselves at the church entrance, like wolves at a sheep pen, and as the faithful filed in for Sunday service, they began to point. The first finger fell on a widow named Kerstin, the second on a midwife called Brita. By the time the sun had reached its weak midday peak, 7 women had been dragged from their families, their screams echoing off the frozen hills. The boys' eyes were glazed, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested something other than human coordination. The parish priest, a man named Laurentius Christophori Horneus, stood behind them with his hands clasped in prayer and his face illuminated by righteous fire. Margareta watched from the shadows of the birch grove, and she saw what no one else could see. The boys were not lying. Not exactly. They were perceiving something supernatural, but they had been deceived about its source. Clinging to their backs, whispering into the soft tissue of their young minds, were tendrils of the hunger itself. The entity had found its instruments. It was using these children to identify not its servants, but its sacrifices. And the parish was paying them for the privilege, 20 öre per accusation. The amount is recorded in the parish account books, preserved to this day in the Swedish archives. 20 öre to transform a neighbor into a monster. 20 öre to tear a mother from her children. The economics of atrocity, Margareta realized, were depressingly simple. The more witches the boys found, the more valuable their service appeared. The more valuable their service, the more witches they needed to find. The hunger gorged itself on this beautiful, terrible efficiency. But the accusations were merely the kindling. To build a proper fire, Vicar Horneus needed confessions. And for confessions, he turned to the children of the accused. The interrogations began in November. Margareta felt each one like a knife sliding between her ribs. She would be grinding herbs in her cabin and suddenly double over, gasping, as somewhere across the village, another child's mind shattered under the weight of impossible questions. Did your mother take you to Blåkulla? Did she make you dance with the devil? Did she teach you to fly? When the children couldn't answer, when their silence threatened to invalidate the accusations against their mothers, Horneus introduced them to the ice. He marched them to the frozen lakes at midnight, cut holes in the surface, and lowered their small bodies into water so cold it stopped the heart within minutes. He held them there, children of 8 and 9 and 10 years old, until the cold did what persuasion could not, until they would say anything, name anyone, confess to any fantastical journey, just to feel warmth again. From her cabin, Margareta wept, not for herself. Her turn was coming. She knew that now, but for what she understood was happening on a level no court would ever record. Every scream of a child tore the sky open a little wider. Every broken mind became a doorway through which the hunger extended its reach. The uniform confessions were not evidence of a conspiracy. They were evidence of contamination, a spiritual infection spreading through the village's youngest souls. The list of the accused grew longer. The net drew tighter. The cell smelled of urine and despair, two scents that Margareta had learned were almost indistinguishable from each other. The stone walls sweated with the condensation of human breath and human terror, creating a permanent dampness that seeped into the bones and never quite left. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman was praying. Somewhere else, another was simply screaming the same name over and over. A child's name, Margareta suspected, though she could not be certain anymore. The sounds had begun to blur together into a single chord of anguish. She had been in the holding cells beneath the parish church for 3 days now, or perhaps 4. Time moved differently in places where hope had been systematically extinguished. The only light came from a single torch in the corridor, its flame casting shadows that writhed on the walls like living things. To Margareta's sight, they were living things, fragments of the hunger that had seeped through the cracks in reality, feeding on the concentrated suffering like parasites gorging on an open wound. The cell was crowded with the faces of Torsåker's women. Margareta recognized most of them, though they looked nothing like themselves anymore. There was Hustru Marit from Ness, a woman of 60 whose hands had delivered half the children in the parish, hands that now trembled uncontrollably against her chest. Beside her sat her daughter Sigrid, a young widow of 28 whose beauty had once been a source of pride and was now simply another piece of evidence against her. The devil, after all, preferred attractive vessels, and in the corner, rocking back and forth with her arms wrapped around her twisted leg, was the woman the village called Halt Karen. Her disability had marked her as other since birth. In the twisted theology of the witch hunters, her body was proof of a bargain gone wrong, a payment extracted by Satan for services rendered. And these women were the debris of a community tearing itself apart. 1/5 of Torsåker's adult female population would eventually fill these cells. The mathematics of it staggered the imagination. Not a surgical removal of suspected individuals, but an amputation of the village's entire maternal body. Above them, in the world of daylight and pretended normalcy, the interrogations continued. Margareta learned of the ovens on her second night in captivity. A girl of perhaps 12 was dragged past her cell, her small body limp with exhaustion, her eyes holding the particular emptiness of a mind that has retreated behind walls it may never emerge from again. The guards were laughing about something. One of them mentioned bread. It took Margareta several hours to piece together what had happened, gathering fragments of whispered testimony from the women around her. The ice ordeals of winter had proven inefficient. Too many children developed fevers and died before they could testify, their confessions lost to the grave. So Vicar Hornius had adapted his methods to the warming season. He was using the hearths now, the bread ovens. The technique was elegant in its cruelty. A child would be placed inside the dark cavity of a family oven, the same oven that had baked their morning bread, that had warmed their home through countless winters. They would smell the soot of 1,000 meals. They would feel the residual heat from coals not quite extinguished. And then Horneus would show them the kindling. Did your mother take you to Blåkulla? Name her accomplices. Name them or burn. The hearth, the sacred center of Nordic domestic life, the symbol of warmth and nourishment and family, had been transformed into an instrument of psychological annihilation. Children emerged from those ovens as hollow vessels, ready to recite whatever stories their interrogators had planted in the fertile soil of their trauma. The confessions became uniform because the contamination was uniform. Every child described the same meadow, the same dances, the same demonic feast, not because they had witnessed these things, but because their shattered minds had been carefully seeded with identical nightmares.
Yet they accuse you.
Margareta felt each oven threat like a physical blow. Through the stone walls of her cell, she perceived the fabric of reality growing thinner with every broken child. The hunger was no longer hovering at a distance. It was pressing against the membrane of the world like a face against glass, its features distorted and eager. On the 5th day, or perhaps the 6th, they came for her. The courtroom of the Hamar District Court was brighter than she expected, lit by tall windows that seemed almost obscene in their cheerfulness. Judge Johan Andersson Hambreus sat at the center of a long table, his face a mask of bureaucratic exhaustion. He had been presiding over these proceedings since October. The weight of it showed in the purple crescents beneath his eyes, in the tremor of his quill, as he recorded yet another name in the ledger of the damned. But it was not the judge who commanded the room. It was the tall figure standing to his right, radiating the particular intensity of a man who believed himself to be at war with cosmic forces. Laurentius Christofori Horneus. The vicar's eyes found Margareta the moment she was dragged through the door, and she saw in them something that chilled her more than any torture ever could. Absolute certainty. Horneus did not doubt. He did not question. He had constructed an entire cosmology in which he was the hero, Satan was the enemy, and every woman in this parish was a potential traitor in an apocalyptic war. In trying to destroy the devil, Margareta realized, he had become the devil's most effective instrument. Force Finskan Margareta, Horneus pronounced, her name an accusation in itself. You stand before this court charged with maleficium and with the trafficking of Christian children to the Sabbath at Blåkulla. The Visgossarna stood in a cluster by the far wall, their teenage faces simultaneously smug and hollow. Margareta looked at them, truly looked, with the sight her grandmothers had bequeathed her, and saw the parasitic shadows that clung to their spines, pumping whispered certainties directly into their brainstems. These boys were not evil. They were possessed, though not in the way the church understood possession. They had been colonized by fragments of the hunger itself, transformed into pointing fingers attached to something vast and starving. I practice no magic, Wanda, Margareta said. Her voice emerged stronger than she expected, carrying across the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Horneus smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. The boys have seen the devil's mark upon you. Will you deny the testimony of innocent children? I deny nothing of what they have seen.
Give them the satisfaction.
Margareta met his gaze and held it. But I question what has been whispering to them about what it means. A murmur rippled through the room. Horneus's smile faltered for the briefest moment. In that crack, Margareta glimpsed something she had not expected. Fear. The vicar was afraid. Not of her, but of the possibility that his righteous crusade might be serving purposes he had not sanctioned. "You speak in riddles," he said, his voice hardening. "Confess, and perhaps the court will show mercy." Margareta looked past him then, past the judge and the scribes and the pale-faced boys, to the window where the light streamed in with such inappropriate gentleness. Beyond the glass, she could see the church steeple, and above the steeple, visible only to her, the rift in the sky pulsed like an infected wound. "There will be no mercy here," she said quietly. "Not for me, not for any of us. The machine has been built, and it will run until it has consumed everything it was designed to consume." She was not speaking to Horneus anymore. She was speaking to the thing that hovered above them all, patient and hungry. The verdict was a formality. The boys pointed their fingers. Margareta's status as a foreigner, as a Finn, as a woman who lived alone and kept to the old ways. All of it became evidence of a covenant that existed only in the fevered imaginations of traumatized children and fanatical clergy. As the guards dragged her back to her cell, Margareta passed the window one final time. The date was late May now. The execution had been scheduled for the 1st of June, 6 days to prepare for war. She did not intend to fight with weapons or spells. She intended to fight with the only thing the hunger could not digest. She intended to fight with silence. Dawn came to Torsåker on the 1st of June like an apology the sky did not mean. The light was thin and gray, filtered through clouds that seemed reluctant to witness what the day would bring. No birds sang. The forest that pressed against the village on all sides had fallen into a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath before a scream. Margareta had not slept. None of the women had. They had spent their final night in a strange communion, not of words, but of presence. Bodies pressed together for warmth in the damp cell, hands finding hands in the darkness, the simple animal comfort of not being alone. Somewhere in those hours before dawn, Margareta had taught them the old hum, that low rhythmic vibration her grandmother's grandmother had used to ground the spirit to the earth. It was not magic, not really. It was older than magic. It was the sound of roots drinking deep. "They will want your fear," she had whispered as the first gray light crept through the cracks in the stone. "The ones who swing the axe expect terror. The ones who watch need to see monsters die, so they can believe themselves righteous. But there is another hunger here, one that feeds on the breaking of souls." Hustru Marit had looked at her with eyes that had wept themselves dry. What can silence do against an axe? Nothing, Margareta admitted.
"There is peace in the snow."
The axe will fall regardless, but the feast, the true feast, requires us to die as they expect us to die. Screaming, begging, broken. She had taken the old woman's trembling hands in her own. We cannot stop the blade, but we can choose what we give to the darkness, and I choose to give it nothing but the sound of my own breathing, steady until the end. Now, as the cell doors groaned open and the guards called out names in voices hoarse from too many executions, Margareta rose with the others, 71 women. 71 lives measured and weighed and found wanting by a court that had abandoned reason for revelation. They filed out into the morning air, blinking against light they would never see again. The village had assembled to watch. This was the detail that haunted Margareta more than any other. Not the hatred in some faces, but the familiarity in all of them. These were neighbors. These were the women who had helped birth their children, who had shared bread during lean winters, who had danced at their weddings and wept at their funerals. Now they stood in silence along the road to Häxberget, their eyes holding the emptiness of mass psychosis. They had been infected too, not with accusations, but with the need to believe those accusations were just, because if they were unjust, then they had allowed their neighbors to die for nothing. And then Margareta saw the pikes. The procession was to be guarded not by soldiers, but by the male relatives of the condemned. The court had decreed it. Husbands would escort wives. Sons would escort mothers. Brothers would escort sisters. It was presented as mercy. Margareta understood its true purpose immediately. It was the final contamination, the final breaking. The hunger did not merely want the deaths of 71 women. It wanted to poison the bonds that held humanity together. It wanted husbands who would spend their lives knowing they had walked their wives to the axe. It wanted sons who would never escape the memory of their mother's blood on their hands. It wanted trauma that would echo through generations. The man assigned to walk beside Margareta was a farmer named Anders. She did not know him well, but she knew his wife had been among the first accused. She knew his daughter had been among those placed in the ovens. His face was a ruin of grief and guilt, and something that might have been rage. He did not look at her. His pike trembled in his hands. "You did not do this," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "I held the pike, and if you had refused, they would have killed you too, and found another to hold it." Margareta felt the last of her anger drain away, leaving only a vast, weary compassion. The machine was built to make accomplices of everyone. That is how it feeds, not on guilt, but on the surrender of people who believe they had no choice. Anders said nothing, but as they crested the final hill and Häxberget came into view, she saw tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. The clearing was larger than she had expected. 3 execution blocks stood in a row, their wood stained dark from use. Beyond them, enormous pyres waited, mountains of timber prepared to burn for days. The efficiency of it was staggering. The court had prepared for mass death the way a farmer prepares for harvest. The executioner stood by the central block, testing the edge of his axe with his thumb. He was a large man, brought from another district. His face was professionally blank. Above it all, invisible to everyone but Margareta, the hunger hung in the sky like a second sun made of shadow. It had grown. Weeks of terror and months of accusation had fed it until it blotted out half the heavens. Its attention pressed down on the clearing, eager and patient. Margareta was led to the second block. Her knees struck the earth. The wood was cold against her neck. In the crowd, she saw the boys whose fingers had begun all of this. They stood pale and sick at the edge of the clearing. The shadows on their backs were so heavy they seemed to bend beneath them. Some part of them understood. Some buried fragment of humanity was screaming. She caught the eyes of the youngest boy. He could not have been more than 13. "The debt is paid," she said. "The gate is closed." And then she began to hum. At first the sound was barely audible, a vibration more felt than heard. It was the old song, the root song. The sound of the earth remembering itself. Around the clearing, the other women heard it, and one by one their voices joined hers, not screaming, not begging, not the broken wailing the hunger expected, just a hum, low and steady, the sound of souls anchoring themselves to something the darkness could not reach. The executioner raised his axe. The blade caught the gray light. Margareta closed her eyes. She thought of her grandmother's hands. She thought of the forest at dawn. She thought of breath moving through living lungs. She did not think of fear. The axe fell. The fires of Häxberget burned for 3 days. The smoke rose in columns visible for miles. But those cursed with Margareta's sight reported something strange. The smoke did not rise toward the rift. It spread outward, low and heavy, like a blanket drawn across a wound. And where it passed, the rift began to close. The hunger had come expecting terror. It received instead 71 souls who refused to break. The silence of the mountain became poison to it. Without shattered spirits, the rift could not hold. By the time the last pyre burned to ash, the sky was clear. The boys collapsed, released at last from the shadows that had ridden them. Most would live. None would escape what they had done. Some met violent ends. Others walked into the forest and never returned. Vicar Horneus continued his crusade for another year. He never understood what happened at Häxberget, never understood why victory felt like defeat. He died certain of his righteousness, haunted by the sound of a woman humming. The village survived, but the scars ran deep. The men who carried pikes never fully returned. The children who learned to see devils grew into adults who trusted nothing. They died lonely. Today, a stone stands in the forest at Häxberget, erected 3 centuries later. Its inscription is brief. Women died, men judged. And if you stand there long enough, listening with something older than your ears, you might hear it. A low hum, a vibration rising from the earth. The sound of 71 souls who refused to give the darkness what it wanted. The sound of a gate held closed. The Torsåker witch trials remain a warning, a reminder of how justice becomes murder when fear replaces evidence, a reminder that monsters do not fly to mythical meadows. They sit in courtrooms, and a reminder that sometimes silence is the loudest rebellion of all. In memory of the 71 victims of Torsåker, June 1st, 1675, may they never be forgotten.